So will those new bank rules pass in Congress? We've got two folks to talk about it. Brad Sherman's a Democratic congressman from California, but first, Peter Roskam, Republican from Illinois. You heard what Mr. Zuckerman just said there, the substitution of politics for policy in specific reference to the banks. Will anything like what the president proposed make its way through Congress, Mr.
Well, I think you got to put this in a larger context, and this is a Congress and this is an administration. You heard Chris Van Hollen a couple of minutes ago. They are desperate to try and change the conversation. The American public is focused on job creation, the economy. I'm sitting here in Chicago today. Our unemployment numbers in Illinois are 11%, and there's a huge disconnect from where the administration has been going. And now the president finds a populist issue, then he can sink his teeth into.
But will it pass?
Well, I think they can pass just about anything they want out of the House of Representatives, but the question remains, what is the Senate going to do? And it's had a real restraining influence on the president's agenda over the past couple of months.
And Congressman Brad Sherman, what is your perspective on the proposed legislation?
Legislative proposal yet. I like the president's rhetoric. It's similar to what I've been saying for a long time. Too big to fail is too big to exist. We can't have major institutions that have this implicit federal guarantee and are able to get capital at lower cost because they're able to tell investors, look, if we can't pay you back, Uncle Sam will. We instead need to have smaller institutions, 50 or 100 billion, 150 billion dollar cap. That's certainly not too small to run a real capitalist economy instead of the socialism for the rich that has been practiced up until now.
How do you react, Mr. Sherman, to Chairman Frank's remarks today about Freddie and Fannie, in which he basically, not completely different to things he said before, but he pushed the P down the path a little farther, that maybe Freddie and Fannie ought to go away?
Well, the idea of having institutions that are both governmental institutions on the one hand and privately owned corporations on the other, I don't think worked very well. And I do think that there is a role for the federal government in keeping mortgage rates low, especially during this crisis. Because if home prices don't rebound or at least stabilize, we're in for another round of foreclosures and a real drag on the economy.
Congressman Sherman, you know, the Democrats want a new TARP tax on the biggest banks, even though a lot of those big banks paid back all the TARP plus a profit plus interest, but we want to keep taxing them to pay back TARP. And now we want to ban them from proprietary trading when there's no evidence whatsoever that any prop trading led to the meltdown. Isn't this more about punishment and trying to make sure you guys don't lose control of the House in November?
Well, the big banks now, the too big to fail, benefited continuously and even today from this implicit federal guarantee, a belief that they will be bailed out if they get into trouble, and that is giving them a lower cost of capital. It is not inappropriate to charge a fee on those who are getting that enormous benefit, but ultimately we need to break them up. We need to return to real capitalism in which no one is too big to fail, and bankruptcy or something very similar to it without a federal subsidy is the outcome when institutions can't pay
We
their
need
bills.
to break them up, Congressman Rock.
Yeah, I agree that there ought not be these types of subsidies, but when you have this top-down approach where the federal government is going to be defining what real capitalism is, and that's going to be defined in the House Financial Institutions Committee, Financial Services Committee, I think that's a real weakness. The president's proposal to tax these institutions is somewhat tone-deaf. Look, they're not taking on Fannie and Freddie. They're not taking on the autos. Those have been the beneficiaries of the TARP funds over the past years, and yet they're not included in this. I have legislation that I dropped yesterday which would cap Fannie and Freddie compensation levels that I invite Brad and others to join with me on to really make some common sense to this. But my hunch is, and the sense I'm getting in the political context, is that the administration is sort of going to the line of scrimmage and doing audible calls and chucking ideas out there, but really not following through with the legislative language.
We've passed great legislative language, or very good legislative language in the House, detailed, hundreds of pages, and it does impose a tax or a fee on those who are too big to fail, who hold our economy hostage and say, we'd insist upon being so large that you can't let us go down. and we're going to benefit from that. And by God, if we go under, you're going to have to bail us out.
Sherman, though, would that include the likes of AIG, which got us into this in the first place and does not technically fall under what the president is proposing?
I don't think the House bill certainly applies to AIG. AIG should be liquidated. AIG, we need to get the money back and not take further risks at AIG. The compensation over there is outrageous and is consistent only with the idea that they want to keep staying at the casino, and so they need the best possible croupiers. That is an entity that should be liquidated to protect the taxpayer from further risk.
And Congressman Roscom, what do you make of this proposal vis-a-vis AIG?
Well, look, if the administration is trying to free up credit markets, like Secretary Geithner wrote last December that they needed to have the TARP authority extended, then let's do that. But the way you don't do that is to send a signal to the marketplace that you're going to have an arbitrary tax on folks that didn't even participate in TARP. That's where this administration, I think, is really, really tone deaf moving forward.
Mr. Sherman, if you were in the Senate across the hill there, would you be voting for Chairman Bernanke?
I haven't evaluated that precisely because I'm not in the Senate. I think it.
You think he's done a good job?
He has not done a populist job. He has done an intelligent, well thought out job of defending the existing institutions that have become too big to fail and who insist upon holding us hostage by their very size and demanding an implicit federal guarantee.
What is this?
And it is not,
Congressman.
and I disagree with my colleague. It is not.
What is this holding hostage thing? You act like they have evil intent to fleece the economy. Yet if they do that, they hurt their own earnings. We need the banks to fuel business, to fuel growth, and to fuel job growth. We need the banks on our side, and you guys are beating them up. How can that help the recovery, sir?
If these banks can be of smaller size, then we return to real capitalism.
Don't you relegate them to mere punks on the world stage, and you let a Chinese bank, a French bank, a UK bank end up dominating the business instead of the U.S.?
$100 billion institution is hardly a punk, and when necessary, banks have done for centuries put together syndicates to handle this or that transaction, so no one of them takes too large a risk. We do not need to have institutions that are greater than 1 or 2% of our GDP. And yes, they do hold us hostage by being that size. They're too big to fail, which means they're so big they take us down with them.
Forgive me for interrupting.
Decision on who's big to fail. Yeah, the decision on who's big to fail shouldn't be made by Nancy Pelosi and the Democratic leadership in the House of Representatives. That needs to be made in the marketplace.
All right,
it's a governmental decision whether to bail out. It was a Republican administration that told us these institutions were too big to fail, and ultimately the federal government has to decide whether we're going to allow institutions to be so big they can hold America hostage.
Both you and I voted against that TARP bill.
Forgive me once again. The contrast couldn't be clearer. We thank you both for joining us today. We'll have you back again soon. Appreciate it.
That was illuminating, but a little too polite.